Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be talking to you today about some of the research I've been doing over the past 9 years here on emerald ash borer and its effects on forests in Ohio. Let's see. All right. So I'm sure many of you have heard of emerald ash borer. This is an invasive beetle from Asia that was introduced accidentally in the early to mid 1990s in Michigan. It wasn't discovered until 2002 when there were quite a few ash trees already dead in southeast Michigan. It's mostly been moved around by human transport since then. This is the type of damage that it does. So it's that larval stage. Let me go back one. So this white larva that lives underneath the bark of the tree is what does the majority of the damage, and this is the damage that it causes. It creates these extensive feeding galleries beneath the bark, which disrupts the tree's ability to transport water and nutrients within the tree, and this girdles the tree, causing mortality within a few years. As it's been spread mostly by human transport, emerald ash borer has now made it to 25 states and 2 Canadian provinces. The red dots are the initial county EAB detection. So if you put every detection of EAB in some of those counties, it would be completely red. But those are just the initial detection in each county. So it's already in the southern parts of Wisconsin. So here we are back in Ohio. This is the first EAB occurrence in southeast Michigan. And my sites are distributed all across Ohio. And we've been studying in these sites the effects that emerald ash borer has had on forests over the past 10 years. So we've been looking at a number of different factors, including ash mortality and emerald ash borer populations, what happens after the ash trees die. They break up and they fall. The other tree species and invasive plants respond. There are effects on forest productivity. So I'll talk a little about each of those. I'll spend a lot of time on this ash mortality and EAB populations. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have time for me to talk a little bit after I've completely depressed you all about a ray of hope, these surviving or lingering ash trees that we've discovered and what we're doing with the emerald ash borer resistance breeding program. So we'll start with the ash mortality work. This work is with a number of collaborators, including Dan Herms, Bob Long, and a number of students who have worked with both me and Dan over the years, as well as some other collaborators within the Forest Service. So you saw that map earlier of our research plots, and what you're going to see here is I'm going to go step through a timeline of percent mortality of the mature ash trees greater than 10 centimeters dBH in our plots across that landscape. So in southeast Michigan, these are plots that Dan Herms established, and then the plots throughout Ohio are going to be the plots I established. And you'll see new plots showing up as we click through, and those are not new occurrences of EAB. Those are that's the expansion of our funding that allowed us to establish new plots. You'll also see plots disappearing as our funding has kind of dried up for some of this work. So the thing to pay attention to is not the new plots appearing, but the color coding scheme here. So white is no mortality of the ash trees, and then as mortality increases, you get darker and darker blue, and finally black as that site reaches close to 100% mortality. So in 2004, Dan Herms was already seeing some patchy mortality in southeast Michigan. As we move forward here, you can see my plots getting established in Ohio. By 2006, there's quite a bit of mortality in southeast Michigan. Many of the Ohio plots are still fairly healthy. By 2008, all of the plots in southeast Michigan were dead, and we're starting to see some pretty high mortality in northwest Ohio. By 2009, most of the northwest Ohio sites are dead as well, and we do have some patchy mortality in southwest Ohio. This was one of the first sites to be infested down there, an outlier infestation. As we continued through 2012, you can see that mortality spreading south spreading into central Ohio sites. And here's the current situation in 2014, where most of our central Ohio sites are pretty dead at this point. In a subset of the sites, we've been measuring EAB populations using the purple panel traps. So we hang up 4 of these traps in each site in ash trees, and then in midsummer, at the end of the summer, we count the number of ash borers that end up stuck to those traps. So this is the shapes designate the number of emerald ash borer that were caught per trap, from 0 in white all the way up to over 100 emerald ash borers per trap in black. And what you'll see is we started this trapping in 2008, so that was, you remember 2009 was when those northwest Ohio sites were pretty dead. So in 2008, you'll see we do have pretty high populations at that point of EAB in northwest Ohio. And then you'll see after they eliminate their food source, that populations in northwest Ohio will decrease, while the populations here in central Ohio, we did have one site that was very high already in 2008. These sites in central Ohio will increase over a couple of years as the mortality there increases, and then they'll decrease by 2014 when most of those sites are dead. So here we are in northwest Ohio, the mortality, or the number of ash borer per trap is decreasing. Central Ohio is pretty high by 2011 and 2012. We have very high populations of EAB in central Ohio, and then we see that decrease as they eliminate their food source. So I'm now going to kind of zoom in. We've kind of looked at this broad landscape scale. So I'll zoom in to 3 specific sites as examples of the ash mortality and EAB populations within a forest stand. So we'll have Darby Creek here that was more recently infested by EAB, Stratford, which was infested a few years back, and then Wildwood, which is one of our longer infested sites. So starting with Darby Creek, the site you can see in green here, we have the number of ash trees that are alive. So we start with 100% ash trees alive, and we're ticking along at 100% ash alive over time. In purple is the number of EAB caught on traps. So we're ticking along with 0 until 2011 when we first detect EAB and on the traps. And in those first few years, EAB populations increase very slowly. We do end up with the ash starting to exhibit mortality just this year in 2014. This is Stratford, which was infested a little earlier. So we started with 100% of the ash trees alive, and you can see that very rapid drop-off of the number of ash trees alive, complete mortality by 2011. And then in purple, the emerald ash borer populations, we were already, when we started in 2008, collecting quite a few EAB per trap, around, it looks like around maybe 60 per trap. In 2010, the number of ash borers per trap peaked at around 160, and then after eliminating their food source, the ash borer population quickly drops off as well, and gets very low but persists over time. And that's what we've seen. None of our sites have we seen emerald ash borer completely disappear from the landscape. It seems to just drop back down to very low levels and persist at low densities. Occasionally we'll have 0 catches in 1 year, but then the next year we'll catch a couple on the trap. And then finally, this is Wildwood. This was one of our sites where we had the most rapid mortality. So you can see in 2005 we've got a few ash trees already dead due to causes other than emerald ash borer. And then suddenly, starting in 2008, we have this very rapid die-off of the ash trees. At that point, you know, we had a good population of emerald ash borer there, probably 150 per trap, and then they rapidly dropped off as well as that food source was eliminated. So just looking at that mortality curve doesn't tell you the whole story of what's happening within a site. So the trees are declining before they die. So this is just that third site, Wildwood. And in green are the healthy ash trees, in yellow are the declining ash trees, and in black are the dead ash trees. So in 2005, when we began our surveys, 80% of the trees, a little more than 80% were healthy. There were some that were declining at that point, and a very small number of, I think a very small number of dead trees at that point, or maybe it's 0 here. Anyway, you can see that rapid decline of the healthy trees and a quick bump up in the number of declining ash. So these are ash trees that are exhibiting dieback or dead branches in the canopy. And it's very typical, if you can see, in 2007 and 2008, we have this mix of healthy, declining, and dead trees in both years. But then by 2010, we've reached this point where we have no declining or healthy ash trees left, and it's 100% mortality in the plots. And this mix of healthy, declining, and dead trees is very, very typical. And I'm going to, about 20 slides from now, I'm going to ask you if you remember this mix of healthy, declining, and dead. All right, so that's it for the ash mortality and emerald ash borer populations. I'll pause for a second to see if anyone has questions on that before I go on to the effects on the forest ecosystems. What are the EAB subsisting on if the ash trees are dead? It's a good question. So the large ash trees are dead, the ones that are over 10 centimeters. We're often left with a lot of smaller ash trees that were too small to be infested. And as those grow up into a susceptible size class, the ash borers do attack those and pick those off. So we're seeing that. And then we've recently heard from a colleague that they're seeing emerald ash borers move over to white fringe tree, which is not very abundant at all in the forests that we're studying. So that's a possibility as well in terms of what it might be persisting on. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, that'll be at the end of the presentation. I'll talk about what we're seeing with that. And we are seeing some survivor trees that we are testing for immunity. All right, great. Well, I'm going to move on and say a few brief words about some of these other topics. So ash tree fall. After the ash trees die, they become brittle and they fall very rapidly. So this is data from, I think, about 2,000 dead trees that we tracked over time. And so on the x-axis is the number of years after the ash tree died. So 0 is the year the tree died, and then 1 year after, 2 years after, etc. And then this is the percent that have fallen. And this could be fallen either uprooting and falling or snapping, either snapping very low on the trunk, or sometimes they snap up a little higher, even up to 10 or 20 feet up in the air. And you can see that over time they do break up and fall very, very rapidly. After 2 years, 20% of these trees had fallen. Once we get to 6 years, it's almost 80% that are down at that point. In terms of ash regeneration, as I was saying, those larger trees are killed, but the ash borer can only infest trees where the trunk is over 1 inch in diameter at breast height. So there are many, as you can see here, very small seedlings. There are also saplings that are too small to be infested that are still persisting in these forests and growing up. However, we don't see any new seedlings coming out of the seed bank after the ash trees have died and stopped producing seeds. So the seed bank gets exhausted very quickly, and then you just have this orphaned cohort of seedlings and small saplings remaining in the forest. There have been tremendous efforts to collect ash seeds that have been headed up by the Forest Service National Seed Lab as well as the Agricultural Research Service, and I've been involved in some of those efforts. And then we've looked at, in those monitoring plots, how those ecosystems are responding as the ash trees died. So we've been measuring the health of the ash trees over time and the symptoms of EAB and EAB populations, which I've talked about. We've also been looking at invasive plants, native plants, light levels, soils, land use history, and then several other factors as well. So this is the basic theory as to the effects of this ash mortality. So you have these ash trees in the canopy of the forest, and the emerald ash borer kills them, and you're left with gaps in the canopy. And there are a few different things that could happen with those gaps. The first is that you have all of these native and invasive plants, kind of a mix in the understory of the forest. And so these gaps allow additional light to come down to this understory layer. And that can cause increased growth of the invasive or the native species. It can also allow the invasive species to get enough light to start reproducing and pumping out propagules. The other possibility is that when the ash trees die, the other overstory tree species could rapidly respond and fill in those gaps. And in that case, you don't get as much light down to these understory species, and it helps keep those invasives in check. So we've been collecting data in the sites to understand which situations each of those two possible paths are occurring. So we've been recording, of course, the ash mortality in the canopy, but also the responses of non-ash trees in the subcanopy and the responses of invasive plants in the understory. And I just wanted to give two examples here. So we're seeing both things happen. On the left here is a canopy of mostly ash trees, almost all ash trees. They're pretty much all dead at this point. This was 2008 in one of the Toledo sites that was the first one to die. And in this site, there really weren't very many other tree species that weren't ash. So that light rapidly penetrated to the understory, and you saw huge increases in light. On the right, we had a very different situation. So the ash trees were most of the canopy, but then in that mid-story subcanopy layer, there was a layer of maple trees and elm trees. And they were pretty spindly and pathetic early on, but as the ash trees kind of slowly died over a few years, those trees were able to really rapidly respond and fill in those gaps. And as we measured light over time, we never saw any increase in light to the understory. So this is a very different situation than a harvest or a sudden blowdown of the trees. As the trees are dying slowly, it does allow that mid-story layer to respond if that mid-story layer exists, if there are other tree species in there. The species in particular that we saw responding in northwest Ohio were the maples and the elms. Of course, the elms are going to get hit by Dutch elm disease as they get older. We also saw several other tree species that were responding, but the ability to rapidly, so on the y-axis here is relative growth rate. So this is a measure of how quickly they took off and grew as those gaps opened up over that time period. So some of them are quicker about responding with increased growth than others are. So we're going to be continuing to measure these factors over time to understand thresholds of how many non-ash trees you need in the subcanopy in order to prevent that light from going through into the understory. And we're also recording what's going on with the invasives in the understory. With the invasive plants, from our data so far, we're seeing that they are present in many sites. There are many different invasive plant species. And which invasive plants you have depends on what kind of habitat you're in. With having 5 different ash species that all live in very different habitats here in Ohio, we have white ash, green ash, black ash, blue ash, and pumpkin ash. And we have, some of those are more upland, drier forest kind of sites like the white ash. Others are swamp species like the black ash and the pumpkin ash. So depending on what kind of habitat you're in, you're going to have different invasive plant species that are important in those ecosystems. And of course, geography, different parts of the state have different invasives, and land use history plays a role as well. The good news was that at most of our sites, the initial invasive plant cover was fairly low. So we're watching how those invasives are responding to the canopy gaps, and there is a lag time. We probably need a couple more years to have those definitive results to really understand any threshold effects. So the implications for management of forests are that we are seeing ash mortality reaching 100% within 2 to 5 years of that first appearance of emerald ash borer exit holes or the first detection of emerald ash borer at the site by the purple traps. We are seeing that adequate mid-story tree density can prevent light from increasing in that understory, which is what we worry about, creating a situation where invasives could be a problem. And we do see many species of invasive plants present in these ash ecosystems. We're going to continue our research to identify threshold levels of ash mortality, mid-story tree density, and invasive plant species that would lead to increases in invasive plant cover and impacts on forest ecosystems. So we can let managers know, what situations do you need to worry, and what situations will the forest kind of undergo succession and take care of itself likely. And then we'll also look at the timing of those responses of the invasive plants as well, so managers know how long they have until they can expect to see some problems. We're also working on research to test restoration techniques in those ash-dominated areas. So we've been planting tree species in the understory to see if we can fill in preemptively. Here's a Dutch elm disease tolerant elm that we're planting experimentally in one of these floodplain forest sites. So that is the whole section on what happens after the ash trees die. I'll pause there for any questions before I move on to these lingering ash and emerald ash borer resistance.
I guess I had a question. I wasn't aware that there was, and I guess that's American elm, not the Siberian elm, is the native one that you saw growing after the ash were removed. Did they get large enough to produce seeds before the Dutch elm kills them off?
Okay, so there's two different things going on. We are seeing elm respond to the death of the ash trees, and the elm that is naturally occurring on the landscape in many of those sites is not resistant to Dutch elm disease. So those elm trees are likely to die from Dutch elm disease that are naturally occurring on the landscape in many of our sites, unfortunately. The elm trees that we're planting in our experimental restoration sites are elms that we have, that others as well as us have been working on developing that do have tolerance or resistance to Dutch elm disease. And those are pure North American elms. After testing thousands and thousands of North American elms that are survivor trees, they have found a number of them that actually do have good tolerance or resistance to Dutch elm disease. So they get the disease, they have some symptoms, and then they recover the following year typically. So those trees are what we're using, and it's actually kind of a good karma kind of coming full circle thing where a lot of these floodplains, elm used to be the dominant large overstory species, and now it typically, if it occurs there still, just grows up to being kind of a mid-sized tree before it gets hit by Dutch elm disease. So we're using the death of the overstory ash trees as an opportunity to get these elms back into the ecosystem that we have now that are the experimental ones that do have tolerance to Dutch elm disease. And you can buy Dutch elm disease tolerant elms. There are bare root ones you can purchase. I think it's JLPN that sells those. There's a handful of genotypes that are currently available for people to purchase, and there are a lot more under testing right now that we're testing at our lab. Good question. So the most frequent invasive species we had garlic mustard, multiflora rose, and then in Ohio we have a ton of honeysuckle. We do have buckthorn as well, but it's not as abundant buckthorn isn't as abundant in Ohio as it is in Wisconsin and Minnesota. But we are seeing both herbaceous and woody. We've got reed canary grass coming into some of the wet sites. So we do have a mix of very different tree species, and then we have some of the a few vines as well. The Lonicera japonica, the Japanese honeysuckle vine, and Celastris orbiculata. I'm blanking on the common name for that. Oriental bittersweet. So we do have kind of all functional groups of of invasive species showing up in these sites.
Oh, thank you. One of the other questions as well, so with emerald ash borer moving east to west and north to south, once they reach the end of the continent, is there an expectation that the spread reverses direction? Or is the expectation that at that point only a small population survives? I think that is, I think that question means, do we expect emerald ash borer to persist at a low level or wipe itself out and potentially see a recovery of ash trees?
Right. At this point, we've been really kind of depressed to see it sticking around at all of the sites that we have, even sites in southeast Michigan where we know that it's been since the 1990s. We're still catching emerald ash borer in those sites. So it doesn't seem like it's completely burning itself out. It seems to be sticking around and picking off those smaller seedlings and food sources. So I don't know if eventually it will burn itself out, but at the moment it seems like it's not burning itself out rapidly. So I would expect that it would move throughout the continent, and it's probably already in many places that we don't even know it's there yet. It's notoriously difficult to detect near the beginning of an infestation when it's at low densities. So it'll move, I would expect it would move throughout the range of ash that it's able to consume and in areas that it's able to tolerate the climate. It does like high humidity, so I don't know how it's going to do in the desert southwest. But once it gets throughout that range, it may just persist at low densities throughout the range and pick off ash trees over time. And I see Emily Anderson mentioned the Princeton elm. Yep, that's one of the ones that we've been looking at using for restoration techniques. We actually have bred it with some of the others as well. So great.
Did you see that question that just came in?
Yeah. So after EAB, do ash trees reestablish themselves, and does EAB come back? I guess it's too early to really see. I mean, so far what we see after EAB is we're left with that orphan cohort of small seedlings and saplings, and those, will persist and grow for a good while over time. I mean, those could sustain EAB for many, many years as they get larger and reach susceptible size, depending on the habitat. So we may, 30 years from now, we may be able to go back and see, are there any of those smaller ones that have grown into larger trees? And we are tracking the smaller ones, but it's going to take a while to really understand what those dynamics will play out as.
It would be interesting to see if
all right. So is
I know with
go on.
With chestnut, there's been some orphan populations that are they're far enough away from any other individuals of the same species that they've been able to persist kind of on an island. So it'll be interesting to see if anything happens like that with ash trees. Yeah, it will. It will, definitely. So I was going to ask if everyone is adequately depressed about emerald ash borer, that we should now move on to this ray of hope of the lingering ash and the resistance breeding program. So this work on the resistance is with a number of collaborators. I want to particularly point out Jennifer Cook, who's a research biologist working at the same lab as I am in Delaware, Ohio. And she has a few people working with her. I've also had a few people who've worked with me seasonally over the years. Another scientist with the Forest Service, Therese Poland, and then at OSU, Dan Herms and his technician Mary Mason have been integral to this effort as well. So when we talk about a lingering ash, we're talking about an area that's been infested for a really long time by emerald ash borer, where 95% mortality, at least 95%, usually closer to 100, has occurred at least 2 years ago. We want the tree to have been large enough to be infested during that peak of the emerald ash borer infestation, so we know for sure that it was really tested well by that population. And we're looking for trees that currently have a healthy canopy. So when you look at the second bullet point, that
we're looking for places where over 95% mortality happened at least 2 years ago. That's where I'm going to go back and say, do you remember 20 slides ago where I had that slide where typically in the middle of an infestation you have a mix of healthy, declining, and dead trees? And as you saw on that graph, at that point in the infestation, that's way too early to start getting excited about the trees that still appear to be healthy. Most of the trees that still appear to be healthy when you're at that stage of the infestation will be dead within a couple of years, unfortunately. We made that mistake. We got overly excited, and then the trees that we were getting excited about died. So we realized we needed to wait a little longer to see if anything was truly a survivor tree. So this was in 2009 when we were at Toledo. So that was when everything was pretty dead. The site at Oak Openings had been dead. Everything had been dead in 2008. And after we carefully inventoried dead tree after dead tree after dead tree in our research plots, on our way walking back to the car as we walked across the bridge, we found this really healthy looking ash tree growing right by the bridge, which was very surprising and exciting. That same summer, one of Dan Herms's students found a healthy tree in Michigan. So the following year, we decided to do a complete survey of the floodplain forest, which is where the green ash trees at the site were growing, at that site to see if there were any more surviving ash trees at that site. So in that survey, we did find 284 live ash trees, and 108 of those did have healthy canopies. So that was 1% of that original population, which was really exciting to us, that we were able to find that many that appeared to be healthy. Now we don't know if those had been infested in the past or not, but they currently had healthy canopies. Almost always those live, healthy-looking ash trees were very near to a dead ash tree that had obviously died of emerald ash borer some time ago. And we know from emerald ash borer's biology that it's really good at finding live ash trees in a forest, even in very low-density stands. So we don't think that the live trees are just in an area that EAB somehow missed. We do know from our traps that EAB is persisting at low densities and may still be attacking those trees. We continued to survey, so that was the first survey in 2010. We've continued to survey those trees each year to see how they're doing. Many of the trees that were healthy in 2010 continued to stay healthy, but some of them did go on to decline and exhibit symptoms and die. And most of those trees that were declining already in 2010 did continue to decline and die. So I'll tell you a little about what we're doing with these healthy trees when we do find them. We found some healthy trees in some other sites as well. This is my colleague Jennifer Cook at our lab, who is heading up the emerald ash borer resistance breeding program. And she's taking a two-pronged approach. The first part of the approach is to hybridize Asian ash species, which are naturally resistant to emerald ash borer, with North American ash species, and then do back crosses similar to the American chestnut breeding program to create trees that have resistance to emerald ash borer, and as resistance genes would be from the Asian populations. The second approach is to look at these lingering or surviving ash trees and screen them to see if any of those actually have natural resistance or tolerance to emerald ash borer. And that's more similar to the elm program, where the American elm, there are very rare individuals that do have natural resistance to Dutch elm disease. So she's looking at both of these approaches. So for those lingering ash trees that we've found, she's been able to graft those. So she uses bud grafting and grows those up to replicate them. So then we don't have to do anything to damage, we collect a few small branches or twigs from the tree that's out in the woods, and then she can use those to propagate it and create a whole bunch of replicates of that same tree that can be tested. So far, and these numbers are out of date, she does have more than this at this point. But she has a number of green ash, as well as she's ramped up the white ash as well. We're still looking for additional black ash. So what she does with them is once she grows them to susceptible size, she's been doing some screening techniques in the greenhouse when the trees are still in pots, but they reach that inch diameter size. So she'll actually take emerald ash borer eggs on coffee filters and put them on the trunk of the tree in a few places and affix them to the trunk, and then 8 weeks later she'll open up the gauze and then peel the bark off the tree to see what happened to each one of those eggs. So you can, after those 8 weeks, one of the things that she sees that's very typical of what we've unfortunately seen throughout the range is a healthy fourth instarred big larva with a large gallery under the bark. But the other thing that she's seeing is some of the larvae actually get killed by the host tree. You'll have some calloused over galleries where it just started to burrow in, and then the larva actually dies. So that's wonderful. And so those results are really promising. She's still working on quite a bit of that. And here's kind of a summary of what we've found with that ash resistance work. A small percentage of ash trees do seem to survive that initial wave of EAB. The ones that have very healthy appearing canopies and no woodpecker activity, the woodpeckers go after the EAB under the bark, are likely to remain healthy. And then of course Jennifer's doing the work to test those trees for resistance to EAB and look at the mechanisms. The preliminary results, seeing some of those trees actually killing some EAB larvae, suggests that some of the trees do have greater resistance than the susceptible controls that she's testing. But they aren't doing quite as well in her tests than the Asian ash species. The Asian ash species are really good at killing the emerald ash borer larvae. And even the lingering ash do let a good portion of the ash borer larvae survive. So that testing is continuing, and she's actually doing some field trials as well. There may be multiple different mechanisms that are responsible for resistance, and our colleague Therese Poland is testing adult feeding and landing and preferences for the trees as well. So the trees that through that breeding program are discovered to have tolerance or resistance to EAB will be used in a breeding program to breed for EAB resistance. And we hope to someday have EAB resistant ash trees that can be used on the landscape for restoration and be available for people to plant in urban areas as well. We're continuing to look for surviving ash trees. Right now we're limiting our search to southeast Michigan and northwest Ohio, and we do have a website where people can submit survivor ash trees. And with that, I would like to thank all of the research sites, funding sources, and many field crews that have collected the data over the years that have allowed us to do this work. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Great questions and a great group.